Have you ever thought about how an act of violence isn't just over in a moment, that it leaves something behind, almost like an echo? Well, today we're diving into this really powerful, kind of poetic idea from some theological texts. The concept that shed innocent blood isn't silent. It actually has a voice that cries out and demands to be heard. So we're going to unpack what that really means.
So, can blood literally have a voice? Well, no, of course we're speaking in a metaphor here. But what if that metaphor is pointing to something deeper, to a profound spiritual reality? That's the big question the source material really digs into, and it's a question that honestly challenges us to think about justice and consequence in a whole new light.
All right, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start at the very beginning, tracing this idea back to its ancient roots. Then we'll get into its moral weight, what the text calls a debt. After that, and this is a big shift, we'll pivot to the theological solution, moving from judgment to mercy. And it all wraps up with a really powerful call to action.
Okay, let's dive in. Our whole exploration really starts with one of the oldest stories we have, a foundational crime that, according to these writings, simply could not be hidden. It couldn't be silenced. And this story, it really sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about.
So this story isn't just presented as, a historical account. It's seen as the #1 example of a deep spiritual principle. Think about it. In the story, there were no human witnesses. Nobody else was there. The only testimony needed came from the victim's blood itself. It was the witness. This right here is the absolute foundation of the whole voice of blood idea.
So here's the key takeaway, the main definition. When these texts talk about blood crying out, they're not just being poetic. They're defining a spiritual reality. It's this idea that an act of profound injustice against an innocent person literally creates a force, a voice that appeals directly to a higher power for justice, and it's a cry that can't be put on mute.
But this voice, it isn't just a cry that happens and then it's over. The source material argues that it creates something that lasts, something it calls a moral echo. So let's explore the real spiritual weight of this voice.
And this isn't like a financial debt, something you can eventually pay off or have forgiven. This moral debt is described as a permanent stain on the land itself. It's an offense that just stays there, unresolved. Time doesn't heal this wound, it just lets it fester.
And this is where that idea gets solidified into basically a spiritual law. This verse really codifies the whole principle. The land itself is seen as polluted, as defiled, and it says it can only be cleansed through a very specific act of justice. It creates this unbreakable link between the action, the consequence, and the necessary resolution. Okay, so if this debt is real, what does that look like in the real world? How is it applied? Well, the next part of our source material explains exactly how this theological framework is applied to specific moral issues, making this abstract idea incredibly concrete.
Now, it's right here that this ancient concept of a moral echo gets applied directly to modern life. The text singles out two specific areas where it argues this principle of innocence wronged is most relevant today.
And those two areas are murder and the destruction of unborn life. The argument being presented is that both of these fall under that same category because they involve ending a life that is defenseless, a life that can't speak up for itself. And in doing so, they create that moral debt that cries out for justice.
To support this idea, the text points to passages like this one from the prophet Jeremiah. The point being made here is that this isn't just a passive idea, but an active command from God to protect the oppressed and to prevent the shedding of innocent blood. It's a call to be proactive when faced with injustice.
So after laying out this pretty sobering reality of a moral debt, the whole narrative takes this really dramatic, hopeful turn. I mean, if there's a problem of judgment that's literally echoing from the ground, is there a solution? Let's check out the proposed path from debt to hope.
So if one voice is crying out for justice, for reckoning, could there possibly be another voice? One that speaks a completely different language? This is the huge turning point in the entire theological argument we're looking at.
And here it is. Here is the answer provided in the text. This verse introduces a brand new concept, the blood of Christ. And it says, "This blood speaketh better things than that of Abel." It's presented as the ultimate answer to that cry for justice, a voice of mercy that's powerful enough to actually overpower the voice of vengeance.
This slide really breaks it down perfectly. On one side, you have Abel's blood. It symbolizes the voice of violated innocence, and it demands justice, a debt that has to be paid.
But in complete contrast, you have Christ's blood, which is presented as the voice of mercy, offering a path to redemption, and paying that debt in full.
Now, it's really important to get the nuance here. This solution isn't about just ignoring what was done wrong. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Instead, it's framed as an offer of cleansing and transformation for people who, as the text says, turn from violence and accept this atonement.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Where do we go from here? The final part of our source material translates this whole theological argument into a very practical, ethical call to action. It's where belief meets actual behavior.
The conclusion that's drawn is this three-part ethical mandate. Because life is presented as sacred, the logical response then is to actively defend those who can't defend themselves, to advocate for those who don't have a voice, and to operate from a worldview that truly recognizes the sacred value of every single life.
And we'll end with the exact question the source leaves its readers with. It's a challenge, really. A challenge to move from just understanding a concept to actually living it out. Are we defenders of the defenseless? In our words, our actions, in everything we do. It's a final thought to chew on long after this is over. Thanks so much for joining us.